Welcome back to the Black and White Photography Podcast, providing news and interviews in the world of photography. Now, here's your host, Jim Horn.
Today on Black and White Photography, who we have, and I'm really happy he came back, Marc Silber. He's the author of the #1 best-selling book, Advancing Your Photography. And I've seen the book. I've got the book. It's an award-winning book. Marc is a professional video producer, photographer, and a photographic or a photography educator who's been successful working in the field for decades. And Marc combines his passion for the visual art of photography with his love of life. Marc has produced, and if you're not familiar with his YouTube videos, go there. He's produced, it gets to the heart of photography, really. It's not about equipment, it's about a lot of other things. And I think we're going to talk about this today. One of the best that Marc has done is he's worked with Dan Milner. And if you don't know Milner, you got to go to his site.
Yeah.
And they don't talk about gear clutter. Anyway, Marc, it really is a pleasure to have you on again, sir.
Well, thank you, Jim. My pleasure to be back. It's always great to talk to you.
Two old-time photographers.
Old-time guys who got their fingers burned in in the developing process. And I don't know about you, but I don't miss that part of it too much, all the chemicals.
Although I must tell you, I'm still doing a little developing. Just negatives and then scanning them and
kind of a hybrid.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good word for it. It's a hybrid. But I it's funny. I did a podcast recently on, will photography ever get back to a minimalist kind of existence, because we're inundated with. Tell me about what's your thoughts.
Well, here's the big difference, Jim. When you and I started out, you got rolling, you bought your equipment, right? One way or another. I had an uncle who was a photographer. He sent me a Rolleiflex. It was changed my life because now I'm shooting medium format. I went from, I don't remember. I was shooting with a Minolta. I don't remember the model number, but so all of a sudden this was a big jump. But this, when we talk about equipment, here's the thing: we did not have built-in obsolescence. Remember?
Yeah.
You could buy a camera and keep it for 50 or 100 years. I mean, it does now. Unfortunately, the manufacturers are pushing whatever the latest thing is, and you've got built-in obsolescence. And I consider that a real tragedy, because the fact of I still own these cameras. I'm sure you do too, right? That you had 50 years ago. And there's something really great about a camera that you've used that much. It becomes a living part of you almost, Like I have a Leica M2. How many controls do we have on that camera?
Right.
Shutter speed, focus,
right,
aperture.
Yeah.
That's it. You can't control the ISO because it's a roll of film. So you have three things that you control, but you got really good at controlling those three things. That's the other part of our modern world, is there's so many menus and so many things that it just appears to many people to be really, really confusing. And it is, until you cut it back to what it should be, which are know your basics. That's my rant right there.
Yeah, well, and how do you see that? I mean, going back to knowing your basics, how do you see that affecting your visualization? In other words, how does that help?
Yeah, so visualization is the heart of photography or creativity. It's in my book, Create. It's the same starting point. And for those who haven't really understood what that word means, and it took me a while to understand it. Visualization means you get the idea before you press the shutter. Now, that doesn't mean you're out contemplating things for a long time, because this is one of the common misconceptions. People say, Mark, I don't have time to visualize stuff. There's a shot there, I got to take it immediately. Well, you're still visualizing it because you put yourself in a place where you could find that shot, if nothing else. But you also, the human mind can work really fast. You can see somebody moving, towards into your frame and go, if I press the shutter right now, boom, I've got the shot. That's still visualization. It happens maybe in a split second. Visualization is the key. This is what Ansel Adams said. The whole key to a photograph is your ability to use your power of visualization.
Do you think?
Then,
Go ahead.
yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Go no.
Well,
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, then you once you visualize it, then you got to figure out what equipment to use, and those things fit together.
Do you think the digital age, I'm not trying to get in whether digital is better or what, not. Do you think the digital age is fostered in too much too soon?
Yes, absolutely. Because Jim, you remember, like when we were shooting film, whatever format it was, you knew you're going to have to go back and work with that yourself. You were going to develop it. You're going to print it. You didn't want to clog yourself up with a bunch of stuff that was useless, right?
Right.
So basically, the mindset became, before I'm going to press the shutter, I I really want this to ideally be a viable photograph. Maybe it isn't, but I'm not going to just, I only have 36 frames here. I'm not going to fire away at this. Digital kind of wiped that away. Now we've got any limitless number of pixels that we can create with. But I still believe that the better photographers that I know operate with that film mindset. They're not pressing the shutter and hoping something will come out. And my nightmare, Jim, I don't know if you've thought about this, but since cameras have all evolved to also shoot video, to me, the biggest nightmare would be somebody who just sprays and just out of 10,000 images, the algorithm picks out the best one. I hope we don't find that happening. But
Well, we're getting pretty close.
I know there's a trend. Unfortunately, that's the trend. But we to back up and remember that photography is an art form, and art is something that you thoughtfully create with, right? Not
Right.
just hoping something comes out. The greatest artists really had that power of visualization before they started anything. So that's the first thing to train yourself with. And there are tools that you can use to train yourself to visualize better.
What would you suggest to the young photographers out there that are listening to this podcast? What are a couple of the tools that you think would certainly help them to get started as in in an organized fashion? I guess that's what I should say.
Yeah, the two best tools are the easiest ones to apply. And number one, and every great photographer, you talk to Dan Milner, he's got a huge collection of photography books. Huge. So look at other people's work, and not just photographers, because remember that photography really was developed about 150 years ago. Okay, so leading up to that, we have all sorts of other art that photography basically took advantage of, especially in terms of composition and lighting. So fill your mind with those art forms that inspire you. That's something just to do on a regular basis, not to copy them, because you're never going to be able to copy them, but to have a starting point. And you can see, like, for instance, for me, the two photographers that inspired me the most were Ansel Adams and Henry Cartier-Bresson. Completely different.
Yeah.
Cartier-Bresson is shooting with a Leica 35 millimeter. Here's Ansel, large format, totally worlds apart, but they both inspired me. So look at art. Ideally, look at it on the wall if you can go to a museum. It's always That's the ideal thing because you're going to see things you're not going to see in a book, even. But if you can't look at it on the wall, go to your library, check out books on photography and art. I do this every week, Jim. I
Oh,
have a
wow.
ritual and I sit there and just take it in and get inspired. I don't even start thinking about, well, how could I use this and how could I use that? It's just a point of inspiration. The same thing happens for me watching films. If I see something really cool cinematically, I I remember that. I go, yeah, that's something I can use. So that's tip number one. The next tip is really easy. Here's a cool story. People showed up for Ansel Adams workshops, right? With a ton of equipment, loaded down with all sorts of stuff. Dan Milner tells the same story. They're coming in with backpacks and they're covered with, three different cameras and 12 lenses. And he's just like, get rid of all that junk. You're never going to be able to follow me around with all that. You're going to just regret that you have all that extra junk. But Ansel did something even more interesting and more basic. He said, don't pick up your camera. He handed them a card. It was a cardboard cutout, like a 4x6 card with a frame cut out in the middle of it that you would hold up to your eye. And he called it a framing card. And he said, the first part of the workshop, I want you to go find photographs. No camera, no lens selection, no film, tripod, all that stuff. Forget about it. Just go out and visualize photographs. Well, it turns out your fingers work just as well. You can do this,
Right.
you can or do this. And I do this all the time. Train your eye. Because the trick is we're walking around, we have this amazing vision. Our eyes are incredible, but they see too much and too far. You have to train your eye to see in a frame, which is usually rectangular. If you're shooting 2.25 square, it's a square frame. Train your eye. Use those tools all the time, and it will help your visualization.
Yeah, there's so much, excuse me, we have, and maybe that's why these wide angle lenses, 11 millimeter, were developed because they're trying to replicate our eye, right?
Yeah, way out here somewhere. Yeah, it's true.
Exactly. And so consequently, we get this, the latest and greatest digital zoom that, and then you look at the photograph and it's got far too much in it.
Too much in it, which is
It doesn't zero down. And I'm sure you, when you were writing your book, Advancing Photography, you were thinking about these things, right?
absolutely. The general rule is that less is more,
Right.
and that certainly applies to composition. You know, what
Now,
can you remove from the photograph to clean it
right,
up?
right,
How can you make this thing simpler? I'll give you kind of my top three critique points because I do a lot of critiquing. Number one, you have to have your subject. It's great to have a beautiful picture of a lake and maybe there's some trees and there's the water looks great and it's a nice what I call set. But what's missing is there's no subject. Wait. Wait for somebody to come along, a person perhaps walking down a path or riding a bike, a bird flying into the frame, a horse, a deer, whatever. Our eyes are going to go to a living form more than this is something I really discovered more than just a beautiful background. So when you wait, and this is the other thing, Jim, you kind of touched upon, our digital world has made us all want to do things really quickly. And art doesn't work that way.
right.
It's like cooking, you could throw everything in the microwave, but it's not good cooking. It ruins the nutritional value and it just kind of levels the whole thing. Good chefs take time. Good photographers take time
And
and
it's
they get to
amazing.
know.
You ask somebody when they come back from one of these workshops, how many photographs or what do you? Well, I got 5,000 photographs.
What are you going to do with those?
What are you going to do with them?
What a headache that is
Yeah, and I think what they do with them is
to
probably
go through all those
to
and
go through
process
all of
them.
them, and and they don't seem to care. I think maybe the number of shots you get puts a higher value on the workshop. Could that could that be?
I guess,
Well, I a couple,
that's
I know Dan because I've watched a lot of his videos, and I think he does a good job. And we discussed this a little bit before the show started.
yeah,
Yeah, Dan is very upright, very frank, very honest young guy.
yeah.
He's 50 years old. I think that's what he is. But more importantly,
He's in that
Dan,
range, yeah.
yeah, Dan works on. I think he works for Blurb, but he works in a
Yeah.
project form, doesn't he? And what are your thoughts about that?
I think projects are fantastic. The best work I've done has always been project based. And it could be your own project. It could be your travels to wherever you're going. I was just in Italy, so the project is telling the story of those places in Italy that I went. But the other thing that he and I have talked a lot about is turn your work into a book. I mean, he works for Blurb for a reason because he believes in this. He's created something like 250 books himself.
Oh, is that? I didn't realize that. Wow.
Yeah. And the thing that I love about books, that we all love about books, is it's a self-contained, completed project that you can then hand off to somebody else. You can sell, you can put on a bookshelf. Because otherwise, my chant is take your photographs off of your hard drive, make prints out of them, turn them into books, you can even edit them into videos, but they've got to come off of the hard drive and into what I call sharing, which is part of the whole process. So Dan, yes, I took a master class, Jim, of a group of photographers who had never published anything, and I walked them through the entire process over many weeks of selecting the right images, putting them together, because there's all sorts of things you have to consider when you put books together.
Right.
What photographs are going to work well together, and you maybe have to change your sequencing around. Anyway, we had Dan as a guest helping us. And at the end of it, we published a book with these photographers. This was the first time they'd ever been published. It was such a thrill for them. I should probably do some more of those, actually.
I think you should. You know who Dan knows? It's funny. I don't know Dan, but I know he knows Melanie McWhorter. Have you heard of her?
Okay. I have not.
And she's in Santa Fe. She's in the same place where Dan is at.
Yeah.
And they're putting together some kind of, I don't know if it's a workshop. It's a 2-day thing. Melanie is a book consultant, very good. And of course, she's right there with Dan in Santa Fe. So it sort of makes it ideal. But I think you're right. I think the book format has been overlooked. For a matter of fact, I must tell you a secret. Because of Dan Milner, I got rid of my printer and went to books.
Yeah.
Because
I'm
just
there with you.
yeah, I just found that the printer was big. It was sitting on the desk. I didn't use it very often.
Yeah.
And when I did use it, I printed photographs and I took them and I put them in a drawer and I never looked at them again.
Exactly, Jim. 100%. And it's interesting. I identified this. I should probably hit all 5 points. We've talked about the first one, which is visualization. We're talking about the last point right now is sharing your work out to the world.
Right.
And I discovered that the most frustrating thing about being a photographer is never getting your work out to the world.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I did a crazy book on, and this was part of Melanie's class on a place called Porto Night in Traverse City, Michigan. And I went around I didn't want to really sell it. I went around to a few of the bookstores. It's a very rural area. But more importantly, I gave it to one gal, and she took it over to the kids in a school. And the little kids liked it. It was a small book, like Milner
Right.
recommends. And
Yeah, exactly.
all of a
Start out
sudden, I
small.
was giving away a lot of these books. But you're absolutely right, Mark. And so, what can photographers do to get on board to show more of their stuff?
Well, first you have to decide that you're going to do this. And talk about, I work with Bay Photo Lab. They're my sponsor. I love these guys because they make it easy to make prints or books.
Yeah.
And what's great about Bay Photo, because I sell my photographs, right? And I can order them online with the mat I want. I always do a double mat. I can frame, they frame them for me, they ship them to me, I sign them, and then I sell them.
Okay.
And so, one thing you should do is the first place to start is to realize that you should display your own work in your home, in your office. You can go out from there. And I have a whole description of how to do this in the book, Advancing Your Photography. Um, but start with your own, like your own gallery, your house, your apartment, wherever you live. If you live in a van, there's still, like Dan Miller's. Half the time I talk to him, he's in his van, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
Dan. Brooks Jensen, by the way, is like that. I don't know if you know
yeah,
Brooks. Yeah, he's up in the northwest corridor. Well, you're in the farther northwest. Go ahead. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
So get your prints out to the world. Make yourself known, and don't just take prints and stick them on the wall. Definitely frame them. Okay, that's point number one. That's probably the easiest and most overlooked, point of satisfaction for a photographer. And then, beyond that, yes, you can make short little books like Blurb. You can make them on Bay Photo. You can get them, take a subject and create a book out of it. And maybe if you write too, you've got two choices as far as writing. If you write, great. You can write all the poetry or whatever you want to put in there. If you don't write, you can find somebody else and use their quotes. And I do both. I do my own writing, and yeah, you notice in my books I put a lot of quotes
Right,
because
and they're very good quotes. Yeah, very appropriate ones.
I,
Yeah.
I search for them and I go, wow, that really fits. And this is a wonderful thing. So you can use those in your books and just start right there. It's an easy way to open the door.
It's interesting. You use and when I got rid of my printer, that's what I decided after all these years. I start going to somebody that can print the stuff for you if you really want it,
Yeah.
and of course you sell it so that, and you don't have to fool around with the printing. You don't have to any of that
It's
stuff.
I got criticized by somebody who left me a review saying, Mark, I don't I don't buy this business of not using your own printer because back in the dark room, of course we did our own printing. And yeah, you're right. But the thing is, printing is a really complicated technological process. It's not easy. The When I do high end prints, I don't do them myself. I go to a trusted printer and I sit down next to them, but they move all the sliders
Right.
because you not only have to process it, but then you have to process it for that printer. You have to know how to make that printer work. Your paper selection, all these things are a factor. And remember, Jim, when it comes out of the machine, you have to put it in a location that's going to look like where it's going to be seen.
Right.
So high-end printers have that all factored into the process. That's tens of thousands of dollars I don't want to spend on stuff.
Well, and then you print too much, which I found, and I had to go through this year. Was it this year? I had a lot of stuff that I had printed and actually had mounted. And
Yeah.
you know what, Mark? I looked at the stuff. No one was looking at it, and I said, I got to get rid of this, and I did.
What
I
am I
got
doing
what?
with all these
What
things?
a
I know.
waste!
It's so true.
Huh?
Yeah, I'm with you. I pay high. If I want a high-end print, I'm going to go to a high-end printer. I'm
Right.
going to sit there with them. We'll tweak it together. And then I take it to a framer There's the framer I use is just a genius. He's an
Yeah,
artist, you know, and that's how you're going to produce your art that's long lasting and is really satisfying.
that's exactly right. I don't think people realize that you know it's one thing to be sort of the home kind of printer, but I've got another friend here in town does exactly the same thing you do.
Yeah.
And he's got his stuff. Actually, he's not even I mean, he's a photographer, but he's my financial guy, and he gets his stuff in hospitals and different
Wow.
places, and so I get out and start. Don't worry about the printing, as Mark said. Get out,
Don't
do
get,
the book, and I think Milner does really small books too, doesn't
he
he,
does.
Dan?
He does them of all sizes. And one of the things he recommends, which I think is a really good idea, I haven't done this, but I do need to do it. Make a small book, and there's a name for it in the blurb
Yeah,
catalog. I don't
I
remember what
can
it is.
remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. But make a book. It's got 6 or 8 pages with your work, and that serves as a your business card. But it's
Right.
way more powerful than a business card because, first of all, people don't want to throw it away, right? Your
Right.
business card just goes in the trash. They're not going to want to throw this book away because you've given them something cool. And it's easy for them to look at. It's only got 6 or 8 photographs in it, but it's a really good calling card. So he recommends that, and that's something really every artist should have,
And
no
it's not
question.
expensive to do
No,
something like that.
they're not expensive at all.
Well, maybe it's $5 or $8, $9 or something like
It
that.
comes
And
down, you buy more. It's not even that much. I think you can
yeah,
get them reduced down, but it's worth it. If you're out, you want to make yourself known, you want to get into galleries or whatever, go see the go see the curator of the gallery. I mean, that's the other thing I recommend is put yourself out there. Go for it.
what do you
You
think?
know?
Why do you think most photographers don't do that? Do you think there was a book called the art of no the fear of art or something like that about getting your stuff out? Do you think that is the part
Well,
of the problem?
you're bringing up this. One of the things I wanted to bring up was that I wrote this book called Create, and I changed the title of it because it had a different title. And what I discovered after I wrote the book is that overcoming fear is the biggest barrier to creativity. And there's so many places where you can get into that fear. One of them is showing your work to other people. And certainly a fear of getting rejected. It never feels good to be rejected. I mean, we don't naturally like that, right?
No.
So the subtitle I have on this is Overcoming Fear to Unleash Your Creativity. Uh, by the way, it's on a pre-order basis on Amazon. It's coming out probably later in this month. But here's the deal: there's many places where you can freeze up, and one of the biggest ways is the fear of, like, well, if I go and I show these galleries my work and they say it's no good or they don't like it, maybe I'm going to be brokenhearted or whatever. Yeah. Here's the thing: you just got to get over it.
I
It's like that in sports,
well,
in love, in if you're a if you are a writer, you put your work out. Not everybody's going to like it. So what?
exact. Two old guys now are talking about this, and we've been through the mill, right? We've
You've been
been.
through the mill.
I have a story to tell you about that exact same thing. It only confirms what Mark is saying. We have a good friend in Paris. She worked at a chocolate shop, and she was a photographer, and her stuff was really good. And I kept saying to her over the couple of years, I said, geez, Rebecca, you ought to get your stuff out. And finally, she did. Now, Paris is a little bit different, like
Yeah,
Italy. There's a lot of small galleries and so forth, but she got her stuff to a small gallery, got over the fear because we talked about it in the YouTube
yeah.
presentation. And sure enough, she quit her job, and you can do that a little bit easier in some of the European countries, but she quit her job and she's going full time on this. And
That's fantastic.
she said to me, she's Rebecca's about 41. So, but she said to me, and this is what we have to do, get out. And she said, if I fail, so next year I'll be doing something else. I'll find another job.
Yeah. Okay. But if
Yeah.
you never tried,
Yeah, exactly.
you're never going to have that satisfaction. So Jim, maybe I should roll through the, so I mentioned there's 5 points of
Go ahead. Go
photography.
ahead, Mark.
Yeah. So we've covered visualization. That's the heart of it. You got to get that down. The next thing is you got to know your tools, your camera. Got to know that camera, which is one reason why sticking with a single camera is better. I mean, I have more than one camera, and so does Dan.
Yeah.
But uh, but the point is, you want to really get to know your equipment and not have to fiddle with it, because the more fiddling you do, the more shots you're going to miss. So get to know your equipment, and then you've got to go out and what we call capture. Capture is composition and lighting. I wrote a book on composition with 83 compositional tools in it,
Okay.
because one of the things I found is composition is like having a vocabulary. And if you only know, I'm I'm pretty sure the average amateur photographer can list out maybe 5 compositional tools that they use over and over again. That's not a very big vocabulary.
Right.
Okay. So if you can expand that vocabulary, you're going to see. So, for instance, diagonal lines are awesome because they give you the feeling of vitality and motion. So somebody's walking on a boardwalk or something, and the boards are slanted diagonally. You'll get the feeling of motion. So your eye can go to that and go, "Wow, there's a cool composition. Let me use it." Okay, so that's increasing your vocabulary. That's capture. Then you edit, you process your images. Again, coming from the darkroom days, we learned how to process our images. And then the final stage, the fifth stage, is sharing it with the world. And those are a cycle because they go around and around. And what's interesting is they complement each other. So when you visualize something later on, you're sharing it, you can hear the feedback that people have. You can see what resonates. For me, like selling stuff, obviously, I'm
That's
going to say,
confirmation. Right.
yeah, it confirms, okay, people keep buying this print over and over again. Well, I'm going to keep selling that print. That's part of my visualization. So it is a confirmation, absolutely. It's interesting too, Jim, in our digital world, of likes and comments and that sort of thing. That's really wonderful. But if you're talking about being a working photographer, at the end of the day, the biggest compliment you can get is somebody buys your photographs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It's you're absolutely right. If somebody's willing to buy your photograph, although I found another little interesting thing that happened to me. Thinking about all the photographs I had stored, and I remember we were moving. Actually, we're moving over here to Arizona, and I had boxes of stuff. And I really never tried to sell it for whatever reason. I was too busy with another job and work. But more
Yeah.
importantly, I let a couple friends go through the boxes. And all of a sudden, I found they liked a lot of the photographs that were there that I didn't think, oh, these been in the box for a long time. So, like
That's
Mark
really
says, you
true.
got to get yourself out. You got to because people, not everybody's going to like what you have, but I guarantee a lot of people are going to like what you have.
It's really true. You reminded me of an interesting point. In the process of editing has two definitions. One is processing, on Photoshop or Lightroom, whatever, Capture One, whatever your platform is. That's processing. But the other definition of editing is putting your work together for a book or an exhibit, right?
Right?
And so you brought up a really good point. I was I went to the same school as Annie Leibovitz, the
Ah,
San
okay.
Francisco Art Institute. And some years ago, I met up with her at her exhibit in San Francisco. At the end of it, it was just her and I walking through her exhibit. I had a video team. They had gone away. Her handlers, everybody was gone. It was just, which I regret that I didn't have a video camera on this conversation. But she said, I told her I was getting ready for an exhibit, and she said, "Do you have somebody helping you edit?" And I thought she meant at first, process. And I said, "No, I do that myself." She said, "No, I mean putting it together in
Oh,
a body." She said, "It's you really got to have somebody who helps you with that. You have to have another set of eyes."
oh,
And what happened with you, somebody came along, looked through your stuff, because we all look at our photographs, and after a while, you make up your mind, now this isn't good, or you overlook sometimes the best photographs. I've
right,
done that.
right.
Yeah.
So
So get somebody you can trust to
yeah,
to help you
that
with
you're
it.
right because they sequence on the wall in a certain way or in a book or
Yes.
whatever, but more importantly on the wall, like it, yeah, and that's important. I was just at a Bresson exhibit in Paris, and they do a phenomenal job of sequencing there. You're sort of willing to follow the wall around and that kind of thing.
That's
You're
right.
absolutely right, Mark. And
And
I
his
would
prints
imagine,
are mostly 8 by 10s. It's
yeah,
amazing, right?
yeah. So this was actually a landscape exhibit, if you can believe that, from Bresson. So
Well,
it was,
I know he took a lot of landscapes, but they
yeah,
weren't, you don't think of him as a landscape
no,
photographer. It's like Ansel Adams took portraits,
right,
but you don't think of him as a portrait photographer, but he took some really amazing portraits.
exactly,
And,
yeah. And he
that
did commercial work too, didn't he?
he did a lot of commercial work. And
Yeah,
that's the other thing. That's a good point. So I love commercial work because Ansel said, the thing about commercial work is it got him to go into situations that he would not have otherwise. Like, for instance, he did a lot of work for IBM, for Chevron, Standard Oil. I mean, Ansel Adams isn't going to look for a Chevron oil tank and take a photograph of it. But he did, and he made it look beautiful. And here's the real cool story about that. So Ansel Adams was obviously a huge environmentalist, right?
right.
So much so that they dedicated in Yosemite the Ansel Adams Wilderness. Well, here's what he did. He worked for Standard Oil, not exactly an environmental friendly company,
Hmm.
especially back then. But what he did was he used the fuel, the money that they gave him, that they paid him, to then be able to go out and do his environmental work. So that's
Right.
pretty clever.
Yeah, that is that. That yeah, that was pretty clever. And anyway, Mark, or anything else that we haven't talked about that you might want to expound a little bit on?
Well, I want to open up, the whole discussion about creativity. And again, this book is coming out. I did publish it in 2019. This is a new edition, 2022,
Oh wow,
and I've added to it primarily because I did discover in that time period that one of the biggest barriers, if not the biggest barriers, is fear. And I give some ways of overcoming that as part of the book itself. Now you may think, well, creativity, that's bigger than photography, isn't it,
right,
Mark? It's true, it is. What I have found too is at least the guys that I hang out with, the gals I hang out with, are multi-talented in their creativity. They write, they photograph, they shoot video, they maybe somebody like Scott Kelby, he is something else. I've been to his studio. He has a complete setup, a drum set, guitar, bass.
wow,
He plays every instrument, every
wow,
single instrument. So that's it. He's got these multi creative outlets. So the thing is, when you're talking about creativity, photography obviously fits into that. But also, one of the things I touch upon is living a creative life. You mentioned, I think, in your intro that we've made photography a way of living our life.
right,
And one of the things, like, you go to Paris, you come back with these amazing photographs. But not only are they amazing photographs, but you train yourself to see things that the average tourist is just going to walk by and miss all sorts of stuff. Isn't that true, Jim?
That's very true. And going back to what you said earlier in this conversation, Mark, is that you've got to go look at things. You've got to get
You
out there.
have
You
to
got to
look.
see.
That's
Right?
right. That's correct. And art of seeing is what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
I-
So when is your book on create? Can you give us? So you talk about fear in the book. Is that the fear of extending yourself? Is
yeah.
that the other chapters that you've added to the book?
Yeah, I've added material into it. Not so much new chapters, but I've added content to the existing chapters.
Okay.
And the main thing is creating a strategy of overcoming this fear. I quote Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, which is a
Yeah.
fascinating book. And he said, when you're faced with a formidable enemy, do not go up against the enemy directly. Come up with a strategy. You're not going to win. Now, if you go up against fear, fear is going to beat you every time if you just go head on, because you're just going to get mowed down. I don't want to put my work out there. How about street photography? People bring this up all the time. I really would like to do street photography, but I'm afraid to go out there and
Oh,
approach strangers,
yeah, that's
right?
for sure.
Right? So you have
Yeah,
to have a strategy for that. How do you do that?
yeah.
How do you overcome this? And that's what the book is really built on. One amazing tool, because the other thing that happens, not only is there fear, but there's burnout.
Mm,
People
yeah.
can get burnt out. Okay. And in our modern electronic world, we're more subject to burnout because if you're out walking around, you're being mobile and active, you're not as likely to get sort of stifled by as we are when we're sitting in front of computers all day long. So there has to be a cure for that. So I actually did a lot of research in this one area, which is in the book, and that is the magic of taking walks.
Mm,
As a matter of fact, and I have a lot of quotes in there, but one of the things I quoted is in 2014, Stanford University conducted an experiment on creativity where they took two groups. One group they kept inside the whole time. The second group went out for walks, and they found out that it increased their creativity by 60%.
wow.
So many highly creative people mentioned the power of walking. Steve Jobs, for instance, he would have, instead of somebody showing up and they sit in a conference room, he'd say, let's go for a walk. This was how he conducted his meetings. And look at the difference. It's a disarming process. If I'm sitting across from you in a conference room, there's already this big barrier of the table and we're kind of hunkered down. He's out taking a walk. They're looking at, nature. They're more relaxed and it lets your mind get uncluttered. So this is one strategy of overcoming burnout, overcoming fear, is take those daily walks. Another one is using your journal.
Oh,
Journaling is,
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
every creative person that I know journals. It's like, without exception. I have so many journals lying around, Jim. Sometimes I've got 3 or 4 going at once. Dan Milner's a huge journaler. One thing I like about Dan's approach to journaling, he takes it a step further. Not only does he write in his journal, but he'll take his home printer, for instance, make a print, cut off the edges, and paste it into his own private journal.
Right,
Nobody else is ever going to see this. It's for him only.
right.
But it gives him a kind of a mock-up of how he could put together a book, for instance. It's really cool.
I remember him talking about that in some of his
Yeah,
YouTube videos, and we
so
just have,
simple.
we have to do a little bit more. I don't necessarily journal, but I have a little app on my, this could sound crazy, on my iPhone, or excuse me, on my watch, Apple Watch, and it's called Brain
Really?
Toss. I heard this from Howard Stern, of all people, but it's called Brain Toss. And
Huh.
when I have an idea, I'm walking by a park, I think maybe that, I just I tell in my watch, open up Brain Toss, and I put the idea in there, and it puts it into my email, and then I categorize it over. Isn't that so? It is.
I got to check that out.
Yeah,
That's a great
it's
idea, though.
exceptional, and you can do it with your phone or whatever. I've got the Apple environment, so it makes it easy.
Yeah.
But I have found, I should do something on that. So anyway, just
I
Mark,
use Evernote like that.
huh.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Evernote app, but I will, like, if I'm looking at a book, I'll use Evernote and take pictures just to remember what these look like
Oh,
and
okay.
and it'll file it away for me in whatever category I put it in.
Well, that's
But
an
those things
interest.
are handy tools,
Yeah,
definitely. Those are
there's
good to
there's
know about,
everything's out there, so to capture those memories, so you can go back and you don't forget, right?
for
When
sure.
is the book coming out? When can we look forward to it?
Well, right now you should go to Amazon and pre-order it because it's going to be coming out I'm going to say within 2 weeks.
Okay.
It's up to my publisher at this point, but I'm thinking in about 2 weeks. But you can pre-order it now, so it'll be shipped to you as soon as the stocks are in.
Will it be in Kindle form too?
Absolutely,
Good.
it's Kindle. It's also an audiobook.
Also audio, because I do a lot of audiobooks. Listen,
Yeah,
I recommend you've gotten on this podcast from Mark. You photographers that are listening in have gotten a lot of great tips. For a matter of fact, we should charge you.
absolutely.
But
Your
I
pay
think
is to go
more.
buy my book.
I think you should. I think you should buy the book because he does talk about the fear that we all have about showing our work, and believe me, just do a little introspection, and I guarantee you're probably having some of the same problems that Mark has mentioned here, as
Yep.
far as going forward. And I'm getting the book, Mark, because I can use it
Awesome.
on my podcast. I won't plagiarize too much, but
Go ahead.
but
Feel free.
I'll certainly plug the book because these are important topics, and it's not all about gear. I understand why the YouTube guys do the gear thing. They get a lot of hits. They get
It
they get
sells.
paid and that
Yeah,
kind of thing, and that's important. That's a source of income for them,
sure.
and you need those reviews. But there's a whole nother part of photography. I would say it's about 80%
Yes,
of photography is really the visualization that Mark talks about. So,
absolutely.
Mark, I appreciate you being on,
My
and I'll
pleasure,
get the.
Jim. Always good to toss around these ideas with you.
Oh, it
Really
really
great.
is two older gentlemen, and we've gone. But I think we probably have a lot of good ideas. Certainly, Mark does, and more importantly, Mark puts them in a book form, and you just go on Amazon, get his book, and I think you'll be. I think you'll be happy and surprised, and you'll learn a lot of new techniques. Thanks,
Thanks,
Mark. Take
Jim.
care, pal.
Okay, you too.